Hello, my name is Patrick Davis. In this narration, I will be exploring the world of transnational cinema, or more specifically, how do transnational films highlight issues across geographical borders. These issues could include social, cultural, and/or economic issues, and how the filmmakers have weaved them into their films. First, I will define transnational cinema. Transnational cinema is a concept within film studies that encompasses a range of theories relating to the effects of globalization upon the cultural and economic aspects of the film. It incorporates the debates and influences of post-colonialism, consumerism, and third cinema, amongst many other topics. Transnational cinema debates consider the development and subsequent effects of films, cinemas, and directors which span national boundaries. Two films which explore the previously mentioned concepts and issues in spectacular fashion are Danny Boyle's Slumdog Millionaire and Nicholas Roeg's Walkabout. I will also later on in this narration be discussing how elements of transnational cinema, such as the alienating clashes of cultures, can be found in the most unlikely of places, when I will be diving into the world of David Lynch's Inland Empire. During Slumdog Millionaire, there is a flashback sequence in which our main character is working in a call centre, in which there are addresses to several famous streets in London, leading to his knowledge how to answer a question on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. The use of iconography in the sequence, British street road signs, highlights the nature of the relationship between British and Indian culture brought on by the long-term British occupation of India. Since becoming an independent nation, India has kept segments of British culture in such forms such as entertainment, in this case Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Another way of putting this is the ever-continuous process of globalization, as Britain is still a predominantly worldwide distributor of culture. It would make sense that it would have merged significantly with Indian culture due to India being a former colony of Britain, and this sequence truly highlights this collaboration of cultures via globalization. Now that I have looked at a key economic issue in Slumdog Millionaire, I will now look at one of the key social issues in the film, which in my opinion is religion, and it's highlighted in a certain sequence. In this sequence of Slumdog Millionaire, we see a vicious mob of fundamentalist Hindus raiding and pillaging the dominantly Muslim slums in which the main characters live. This is a culture clash when in society has a dominant religion. Any other religion is seen as inferior, invalid, or even a threat to the majority and must be stopped. This kind of behaviour is not exclusive to India. In the UK, Muslims are frequently the targets of racist and religious attacks from the other dominant religions. Danny Boyle may have included this sequence in the film as religious conflict is a social and cultural problem that is prominent throughout the world. Therefore, this ties in very well with the concept of Slumdog Millionaire being transnational. In Walkabout, director Nicholas Roeg has cleverly weaved in themes of alienation in post-colonial Australia. The scene which captures this ill of post-colonialism at its finest is the scene in which the two main characters first encounter the Aborigine boy on his walkabout. Jenny Agata's character desperately tries to explain to the boy that they need water to drink. She is completely oblivious to the fact that this Aborigine boy has probably never encountered a British person in his life and can't speak English. This moment in the film captures the division between the two worlds of Australia in complete alienation. This is the result of colonialism in Australia, which caused the native Aborigine people to become outcasts in their own country. It is quite comical when a younger brother explains to the boy their predicament using simple hand gestures, much to the amusement of the Aborigine boy, as he uses his survival skills to fetch them water. This scene is beautiful as it is important in showing how communication between all humans is not impossible, and languages are simply ways of dividing the human race. It is interesting to note that when this film was released, it was considered by many Australian audiences to be anti-Australian, as there were many scenes in which Rogue appears to be criticising the typical Aussie culture, depicting it as misogynistic and ignorant. However, it is not anti-Australian, it is simply shining a light on the part of Australian culture that has been swept under the carpet by colonialism and capitalism. It is this observation of post-colonialism and the study of human communication that makes Walkabout not only one of Rogue's greatest films, but also one of the greatest British-Australian cinema collaborations of all time. From observing two films that are considered transnational, and how the issues raised in those films can be related to by a universal audience, I will now show how these messages can be distorted or lost in the boundaries of national cinema by looking at a somewhat unconventional source. That source being David Lynch, a surrealist filmmaker whose work isn't often associated with transnational cinema. However, in recent years he has produced material to the contrary. The last film released under his list of rather dark and puzzling films, Inland Empire, is perhaps his most complex avant-garde contribution to cinema to date. However, the reason why I chose to use this for demonstrating how the film actually, in a very bizarre manner, addresses some of the issues of the interpretations of the purpose or meanings of stories when transported across borders, adding to the concept of language and culture acting as barriers when attempting to uncover, in this case, understanding what the filmmaker is trying to say. The main plot of the film, if you can even call it a plot, involves an actress, Nikki Grace, played by Laura Dern, preparing to act in a large Hollywood production, which later on in the film is revealed to actually be a remake of a doomed Polish film project which was never finished due to an unspeakable tragedy. Before and after these revelations, there are rather absurd and somewhat unrelated sequences in which a series of events happen, first with the main character and several other American figures. Then, the exact same sequence plays out with Polish characters in a completely different setting. As this happens, the story blurs and goes off the rails, but what is interesting and most importantly relevant about this language and culture transition during the film's notorious meltdown is that it could possibly be highlighting the dangers of an overexposed indulgence of Western cinema colliding with the much more mysterious and daring rush of new wave European cinema, of which Lynch has been largely influenced. Could this be Lynch presenting to the audience an advocacy for transnational cinema? If this is so, he is doing this by showing how the conventions of one culture clash with others through the art of cinema. A scene which may be metaphorical for this is a segment in which Dern's character finds herself in a cinema, watching herself watching the cinema screen. This rather experimental and disorientating sequence could be interpreted as Grace has become a member of the audience, observing the disastrous consequences of the limitations of national cinema, attempting to convert into another culture, another reality. So all in all, even David Lynch has found a way to introduce the idea of transnationalism in his films by showing how national cinema, in this case Hollywood, creates its own set of fantasy-like values and cultures which are destroyed when met with a completely different set of cultures or national identity.
Nadał paplał coś o jakimś Inland Empire.
In conclusion, I will briefly reflect on what I've discussed and what the result of the above discussion is ultimately. I have explored how transnational cinema has introduced audiences to evolved and contemporary themes and subject matters such as globalization and how it ultimately affects the world we live in, followed by digesting the conventional themes of alienation and language barriers, and how the exploration of these themes and conventions ultimately makes the movie-going experience of transnational cinema much more rich and authentic than that of national cinema, to the extent where it has made a significant change in the way in which narratives are told by the major film distributors, e.g. Hollywood. In my opinion, transnational cinema is the future of all cinema, as the requirement of barriers such as language and race are becoming increasingly redundant with the increase of multiculturalism and the financial success of transnational cinema as a whole. On that rather optimistic note, I shall conclude my discussion.